The sun hung low over the rugged hills, casting long shadows over the barren land. Dust swirled in the air as Emma wiped the sweat off her forehead, her hands rough and calloused from weeks of working under the relentless sun. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, deep in the heart of her uncle's mining operation, miles away from anything that resembled civilization. But here she was, trying to prove herself, trying to make a difference. Her Uncle Bill had been in the mining business for decades, a towering man with a booming voice and a permanent layer of dust clinging to his clothes. He was respected by his workers, but carried an air of mystery. He rarely spoke about the details of his operation, only ever mentioning how the mine had kept their family afloat for years. To Emma, the work seemed straightforward: dig, extract, and move on. But something always felt off. At first, she brushed off the strange occurrences. The way some workers would lower their voices when she walked by, the restricted areas she was warned to stay away from, the uneasy glances exchanged among the crew. It wasn't until she noticed the odd barrels stacked in a remote part of the mine that her curiosity got the better of her. They were old, rusted, and unmarked. Something about them didn't sit right. One evening, after most of the crew had cleared out, she decided to take a closer look. The entrance to the storage area was locked, but she had seen where her uncle kept the spare keys. Her heart pounded as she slipped inside, the dim light barely illuminating the stacked containers. The smell hit her first. Sharp, chemical, unnatural. She stepped closer, brushing the dust off one of the barrels. And that's when she saw it. A faint, almost faded marking, indicating something she had only seen in textbooks. Hazardous waste. Her stomach tightened. Why would hazardous waste be stored here? And why was no one talking about it? She pulled out her phone, snapping a few quick pictures before the sound of footsteps made her freeze. Emma! She spun around to see her uncle standing in the doorway, his face shadowed under the single overhead light. His usual easygoing demeanor was gone. In its place was something much colder, something that sent a chill down her spine. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable warning. Emma swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice calm. "What is this stuff, Uncle Bill?" He exhaled slowly, stepping forward. "You wouldn't understand. Just stay out of it." But Emma couldn't let it go. She knew enough to recognize that something was terribly wrong. The barrels weren't just abandoned junk. They were dangerous. And if they were leaking into the ground, into the water, into the very land people lived on, it could mean disaster. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. This wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a cover-up, and she couldn't stay silent. The next morning, she made a decision. She pulled out her phone and made the call. "EPA emergency hotline. What's your report?" She took a deep breath. "I think there's illegal waste disposal happening at my uncle's mine, and I have proof." Silence on the other end. Then, "We'll need details. Can you provide an exact location?" As she relayed the information, she felt a mix of fear and resolve. There was no turning back now. What she didn't know was just how deep this secret went, or how dangerous uncovering the truth would become. The silence after Emma's call to the EPA felt heavier than the weight of the secret she had just exposed. She knew she had done the right thing, but that didn't make the fear in her chest any smaller. Would they come right away? Would her uncle find out? And more importantly, how? Much danger had she just put herself in. She spent the rest of the morning pretending everything was normal, going through the motions as if she hadn't just set something in motion that could change everything. But beneath the surface, She was on edge. Every glance from her uncle felt like it lasted a second too long. Every conversation with the workers seemed more hushed than usual. It was as if the mine itself knew a storm was coming. By lunchtime, Emma overheard something that made her stomach turn. Two workers near the supply shed were whispering, their backs turned to her. "They're coming," one of them muttered. Emma stopped mid-step. Did they mean the EPA? Had word already spread? "Bill's handling it," the other one said, his voice lower. "Says it's nothing to worry about." She forced herself to keep walking, her pulse hammering in her ears. If her uncle knew the authorities were on their way, there was no telling what he'd do. Would he destroy the evidence? Move the barrels? And if he found out she was the one who called, what then? That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She kept replaying everything in her head. The way her uncle had warned her. The way the workers acted like something was being hidden. She needed to know more. If the EPA was coming, they'd need real proof, not just the few photos she had managed to snap. Slipping out of her bunk, she grabbed a flashlight and her phone and headed toward the storage area. The mine was eerily quiet at night, the usual hum of machinery replaced by the distant rustle of wind through the dry hills. She moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, her heart pounding as she reached the rusted barrels. She pulled out her phone and took more pictures, this time capturing the way some of the barrels were leaking dark stains onto the dirt. Then she noticed something she hadn't before. A small logbook on a nearby table, its cover smudged with grease. Flipping through it, her stomach tightened. It wasn't just a few barrels. According to these records, hazardous waste had been dumped here for years. Worse, some of it had been buried. A sound made her freeze. Footsteps. She turned off her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. A flashlight beam swept over the barrels, then flicked off. Silence. Then, a voice she knew all too well, Emma. Her uncle's voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something dark. She stepped forward slowly, her pulse racing. "Uncle Bill, You shouldn't have come back here," he said. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "You've been asking too many questions." Emma clutched the logbook behind her back. "I just wanted to understand." Her uncle sighed, shaking his head. "It's not that simple. You think this is just about a few old barrels. You think I wanted this?" He stepped closer. "This mine was dying, Emma. Regulations were strangling us. The money was running dry. And then," he hesitated, "an opportunity came up." She felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of opportunity?" His expression darkened. "A way to keep the mine running. A way to survive." Emma took a shaky breath. "By dumping toxic waste." Her uncle's jaw clenched. "I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice." Her voice was firm, despite the fear crawling up her spine. "People live here. They drink the water. What happens if—" "I know," he snapped, then sighed heavily. "But it's done. And if you think calling the EPA is going to fix anything, you don't know how deep this goes." Emma's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, a new sound filled the air, the distant rumble of tires on dirt. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the entrance to the mine. The EPA had arrived. Her uncle's face hardened. "You don't understand what you've done." Emma swallowed. "I did what was right." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without another word, her uncle turned and disappeared into the shadows. Emma watched as the government vehicles rolled to a stop. Agents stepping out, their flashlights scanning the area. She knew the truth was about to come out. But what she didn't know is how far some people would go to keep it buried. Emma stood frozen as the bright beams from the EPA vehicles sliced through the dark. Turning the quiet mine into a stage, the agents moved with purpose, scanning the area, their expressions unreadable. Her heart pounded. This was it, the moment everything would change. One of the agents approached her. Emma Reynolds. She swallowed hard and nodded. Yes. We received your report. His tone was professional, but firm. We need you to show us what you found. She nodded again, casting a quick glance toward the shadows, where her uncle had disappeared. A part of her still couldn't believe this was happening. The man who had taken her in, given her a job, treated her like family, was at the center of something much bigger than she had imagined. And now she had turned him in. Taking a deep breath, she led the agents toward the storage area. The second, their flashlights landed on the rusted barrels. The tension in the air thickened. One of them knelt down, examining the ground where dark stains seeped into the dirt. Another flipped open a notepad, jotting things down. We'll need to take samples, one of them said. Emma pulled out the logbook she had taken. This has records of the disposal, she said, handing it over. The agent flipped through it, his brow furrowing. This goes back years, she nodded. And some of it, she hesitated, then forced herself to say it. Some of it was buried. The agents exchanged a look, and immediately, one of them radioed for backup. More headlights appeared in the distance. As additional vehicles approached, Emma watched as they began marking off the area, setting up temporary lights, preparing for what looked like a full-scale investigation. Then, a voice rang out from behind her. "This is private property!" Emma turned to see her uncle walking toward them, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. He was trying to keep control, but she could see the tension in his eyes. One of the EPA officials stepped forward. "Sir, we have reason to believe hazardous materials have been illegally stored and disposed of on this site. We're conducting an environmental investigation." Uncle Bill's hands clenched into fists. "You have no right to be here without a warrant." "It's on its way," the agent said. "But given the potential environmental risk, we're authorized to begin assessments immediately." Emma held her breath, waiting for her uncle to argue, to push back, to deny everything. But instead, he just stared at the barrels, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say a word. Then slowly, his shoulders slumped. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said quietly. Emma felt a lump in her throat. She had spent weeks trying to figure out the truth, but standing here now, seeing the weight of it finally settle on her uncle's shoulders, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like loss. The agents continued their work, setting up a perimeter, taking samples, documenting everything. The night stretched on, the mine no longer a place of business, but a crime scene. Finally, an officer approached Uncle Bill. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning." Emma watched as her uncle gave her one last look. There was no anger in his eyes, no blame, just exhaustion. He nodded slowly, then turned and followed the officer toward one of the vehicles. As the door shut behind him, Emma let out a shaky breath. It was over. The next few days were a whirlwind. The EPA launched a full investigation, uncovering even more buried waste than she had imagined. The contamination had been spreading into the groundwater, putting nearby communities at risk. The story made headlines, and soon, authorities were involved at a higher level. Her uncle was charged, along with several others who had helped cover up the illegal dumping. She learned that he had been under financial pressure for years, that a third party had offered him money to store the waste, promising it would never be discovered. He had taken the deal, thinking he could keep it quiet, but secrets like that never stay buried forever. Emma stayed in town long enough to see the cleanup efforts begin. It would take years to fix the damage, but at least now, something was being done. The land, the water, the people, it all had a chance to heal. Before leaving, she visited her uncle one last time. He was quieter now, the weight of his choices heavy on his face. "You did the right thing," he finally said. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. It hadn't been easy. It had cost her more than she ever expected. But if there was one thing she had learned, it was that doing the right thing was rarely the easy choice. As she drove away from the mine for the last time, she looked out at the land, stretching endlessly in every direction. It had once felt like a place of opportunity, of hard work, of family. Now it was a reminder, a lesson she would never forget. Some secrets are meant to be uncovered, and sometimes standing up for the truth is the hardest thing you'll ever do.